Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special discussion on the case for diversity in clinical trials. I'm Rick Wade, Senior Vice President for Strategic Alliances and Outreach at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Over the past 10 months, we've all seen the impact of the minority community, the brunt of COVID 19, with Black Americans dying at 1.6 times the rate of their white neighbors. Early on in the pandemic, the chamber set out with one question in mind: how can we change that? And we believe that part of the solution is ensuring that new COVID 19 treatments are being tested in populations most impacted by the virus. And if we achieve greater diversity in clinical trials, we believe that we can make strides, great strides, towards the development of treatments that help prevent the disease, lessen its severity, and ultimately prevent deaths in the Black and other communities of color. I worked in the biopharmaceutical industry. It was my first entry into the private sector. So I know the important role that these therapies play. And I'm passionate about this issue. And I, like so many others, have not only lost family members, but also friends to COVID 19. And so, to that end, I'm honored. I look forward to this wonderful conversation. We're joined by two experts in this space: Quita Highsmith, Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech, and Nick Kenney, Chief Scientific Officer at Syneos Health. Welcome to both of you. Both of you have tremendous experience in clinical trials, patient inclusion, and so much. And we look forward to this very important conversation. And so let's jump right in as we think about racial diversity in clinical trials. My experience is that perhaps people don't understand what a clinical trial is, why is it important, and how do you even define a clinical trial? Quita, let's start with you. What is a clinical trial?
All right, thanks, Rick, and thanks to the Chamber for having us. Let me back up a little bit, just so people know who Genentech is. Genentech is considered the founder of the biotech industry. We started our company 43 years ago, and we are located in South San Francisco, and clinical research is at the heart of what we do. And clinical research is usually a multi-center approach that helps us evaluate disease activity and the safety and efficacy of medical products for patients that have the disease.
Nick, jump in. Your perspective. You're in this whole continuum as well. Why is this so important to you and your organization?
Yeah, no, Rick, that's a great question. And first and foremost, I'll echo what Quita said. It's a pleasure to be with you all in the chamber today to talk about really what is a tremendously important topic. And frankly, I think for me, one of the silver linings coming out of the COVID pandemic is that it's shone a brand new light on a long-standing problem that I think from both a healthcare perspective and an industry perspective is long overdue for a lot more attention. Rick, I think for me, Quita's done a great job of describing to you what a clinical trial is, the way that we evaluate potential new medicines for illnesses where there is no therapy or there's poor therapy. And so for me, there are two, I think, important things that we look at as an organization. And just to back up, so Syneos Health supports companies like Genentech and their ability to execute clinical trials around the world. Right? That's our job. And the two important things for me are first and foremost ethics and then science. Right? If I begin with ethics, it's to ensure that we have equitable access for everybody to clinical trials, because you can think about a clinical trial truly as being part of the continuum of healthcare. So as I've said, many illnesses either don't have a therapy still or have inadequate therapy or things that could be better. And we're continually trying to develop new medicines that will address those unmet needs or improve therapies. And that's true whether you're thinking about rare diseases or major cancers. And so really, access to trials allows folks who may have either exhausted current options or have no options. It allows folks to participate in a controlled, safe setting to evaluate potential new medicines and new therapies. So if you think about that, why should where you live, how you live, what your race is, gender, age, sex, any of those things, why should that impact your ability to participate in a clinical trial? It shouldn't, right? We should be evaluating new medicines in the people who get the illness and need the therapy. So I think the second part of that then really is about the scientific imperative, if you like, for including diverse patients in clinical trials. Because if you roll a medicine out into the world and you are then using it to treat people who may have a slightly, perhaps different genetic makeup, you might get some nasty discoveries about how that medicine behaves in the real world. And I think if you look back, for example, in the recent approval of many medicines, say for myeloma, those medicines were evaluated largely in people like me, right? And it's people like me actually get the disease a lot less than African Americans. So I think we need intentional design to help us pull in the right people into the trials where the disease burden is. So those are the two, I think, most important things for our organization.
And Nick, let me add a follow-up to that, and then I want to bring Quita back in. But when you think about the skepticism, how have you seen that manifest itself? The doubt among, particularly in Black Americans and others, about clinical trial. How has that played out during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, great question again, Rick. I think we've all seen, a lot of the press. There've been some great reports, both in journals like JAMA and things like Stat News and the more popular media as well, that there has been a natural hesitancy, I think, for African Americans and other minority groups to participate in clinical trials. And I think really there are multiple underlying parts of that. One is that I think here are some communities that historically are frankly poorly served or have poor access to basic health care. And now we're asking people to participate in a trial. I think anybody in that setting is going to be hesitant that they might feel like they're going to be a guinea pig, right? It feels more like you're being targeted than you're being included in something. And really it's that sense of inclusion that we should be focusing on more than anything, right? I think we're also all fully aware that historically there's a huge mistrust dating back to Tuskegee and many other examples that is still requiring a lot of our attention. And then I think the other part, honestly, for me, that hesitancy, and Quita is probably much more eloquent about this than I am, but I think we have to begin to acknowledge people's concerns and acknowledge that there is still systemic bias and racism in our healthcare system. And if we can get to that point and acknowledge people's concerns and validate their fears and then explain what this is really all about and what it isn't about and dispel a lot of the misinformation, both substantial and proactively distributed, unfortunately, then I think we have an opportunity to effect a change. I mean, Quita, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, but and Quita, let's bring you in because you touched on something, Nick, about the acknowledging the racial inequality, and we got to acknowledge that from a historical perspective as well. It didn't start today. And Quita, I know that you and I have talked, and this is something that you have been very voiceful around. So, I mean, what about this historical dimension of racial inequality in clinical trials and in healthcare broadly, and how do structural inequalities even play in some of the health equity issues and concerns that we see today?
Over 50 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King said, of all the forms of inequity, of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And as we enter 2021, still in the midst of this devastating pandemic, Dr. King's message still strikes a particular chord. There is a long history, as you both have alluded to, of mistreatment in the Black community by the healthcare industry. And we are seeing that persistent systemic inequity today, right now. If we look at breast cancer mortality rates, 40% higher among Black women than white women. There was just a recent study published that showed, unfortunately, Black babies, newborns, are more likely to die if they are not treated by a Black doctor. And Rick, you touched on this in your comments. Black people are more likely to die from COVID-19 compared to any other demographic. And we need to make some changes. But first, we have to understand what we need to do. And one of the things that we did this past summer at Genentech, we did a study, a patient experience study, over 2,000 patients that participated, for us to understand what our actual real patients experience like with the healthcare system. We did 1,000 in the general public, white, and then we did 300 each medically disenfranchised Black, Latinx, Hispanic, low socioeconomic status, meaning people who make less than $35,000 a year, and LGBTQ+. And what did they tell us? They told us patients don't believe that they're going to be treated fairly and that there is an equity in healthcare. These medically disenfranchised patients even believe the system is rigged and out to get them. And the medically disenfranchised patient is delaying or discontinuing care because they don't feel understood. There's a lack of empathy. And let me just give you a personal story to bring this point home. I got invited to participate in a COVID-19 vaccine clinical trial in December of 2020, so just last month. And the first call that I got on, the investigator was condescending. And so they reached out to me and they said, we're looking for people of color to participate in this COVID-19 vaccine clinical trial. So I'm in this industry. I have never participated in a clinical study before. So I wanted to understand what would be the perspective from a Black person participating. And I have to tell you, after that first initial call where they were disrespectful to the participants on the call, I thought, you know what, I'm not going to participate. But then I thought, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and finish. And then on the day that I was supposed to go in for, and I did all the pre-work, the day that I was supposed to go in for the injection. So this is a placebo control, meaning that some people were going to get a saline shot and some people were going to get the experimental vaccine. They called me up 4 hours before I was to go in, and they said to me, we're sorry, but the sponsor has decided to deprioritize Blacks. And I was like, what did you say? And they said, the sponsor has deprioritized Blacks, so we don't need you to come in anymore. It was like a slap in my face. It was very disrespectful. They would have never said that to a white person. I have rearranged my whole day so that I could go into this clinical study and participate. And this is what you tell me? Just disrespect. And so I'm in the industry. So luckily I called up the CEO of the company, who's the sponsor, and told him, and he was outraged because he said that's the furthest thing from the truth. We're actively recruiting people of color so that we are able to understand how our product works in people of color. But just think about that. If I had been in this industry and called the CEO myself, I would have thought the company was the one when it was really the investigator and that site. And so, it is appalling how Black people are treated when we are trying to participate in healthcare research.
But Quita, but how prevalent is that? I mean, what a fascinating story, and it's so appropriate for this conversation because we got to be transparent and candid. But how prevalent is that? And if it's not the company, it's the investigator. Is training the answer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Training is super culturally sensitive. Training is very important. And people would think that happens in the 50s, right? They would tell you to your face, the company has deprioritized Blacks. That is happening in 2020 and 2021. And so how are communities of color going to want to participate if we're not wanted? And when we are wanted at the beginning, and then somebody makes a determination that we're no longer needed, we're just discarded. I will tell you that post that call with the CEO, that site called me back, apologized, and now I'm getting the red carpet treatment, but my original treatment was very disrespectful. And I have to say, with this current experience, we're going to double down at our company to ensure that investigators are really being culturally sensitive and really encouraging communities of color to participate. And there's a lot of work that can be done. For one, we need to ensure that we are increasing our representation with communities of color. And we need to be thinking about our opportunities to meet them where they are. So we have a principle that we call the three B's, right? To reach communities of color where they are: the bishop, i.e. the church, the barbershop, and the beauty salon. because we've got to be able to get more information out to communities of color with where they are, because they're not going to necessarily have an investigator site call them like they called me. And I asked that site, I'm like, how did you get my name? Because I certainly didn't sign up or anything. And they said that through the NIH, which I do think is a good practice, that NIH provided them a national list of diverse people who could potentially participate in the study.
Well, listen, thank goodness that you, coming from the industry, that you were aware enough to pose those questions to that CEO. Nick, you know, your organization, you work with so many biopharma companies. Tell us about how you approach addressing patient diversity in clinical trials. Maybe how did you begin? Or where are you on the journey? And kind of where do you see it going? I mean, where's our goal and what's the map forward?
Sure. I think first I just want to read it. That is such a powerful story. And I think for me, it's a story that needs to be told over and over again. And I'll maybe elaborate on why in answering your question, Rick. So really, I think where we began as a company is to recognize that, you know, traditionally as an industry, when we face a problem, we look for one button to push to fix it. There is not one button to push to fix this issue, right? It's an integrated solution that you need, sort of coming together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And for us, that really began with education. You know, first and foremost, education of our own staff, so that people would peel away the layers of this and recognize just what a significant issue this really is, which Quita is why it's so important to hear your story directly, because I think people still underestimate the magnitude of the challenge that there is here with bias at institutions, with lack of adequate representation in the medical community. I mean, what's the latest number I've seen in JAMA? Maybe 5% of physicians in the US are African Americans. That's insane. That hasn't moved since the 1970s. So when you can't have people like you reaching out to you to engage in your medical care, much less think about a clinical trial, we have a significant issue. So Rick, we really began with a journey of education to explain what is the basis for this problem, why is it ethically and scientifically important, and what role can we play in addressing that. The next part then for us is that, as you said, we serve a very broad community in the biopharmaceutical industry. So all the way from organizations like Genentech and other large pharmaceutical companies that have become very sophisticated in this space and are investing it very heavily and being very proactive, much as Quita has explained, all the way through to small startup companies who are developing novel medicines, but maybe a very small team. And they're really coming to us and saying, I know this is an issue, but I have no idea what to do. Help me. So we have to span that whole spectrum from helping small companies to across the spectrum to resonating with the activities that larger companies have already got. And then really the next part for me is to have our physicians who review new study opportunities to look at them through a new lens and to say, what is the disease burden in this trial, in the jurisdiction in which you intend to conduct the trial and seek registration for the drug? And if that's the US, we need to immediately dive into where is the disease burden, who's affected, and how do we get to those patients, right? I think one huge challenge for us as an industry and us as a provider to industry, and Quita, this goes to your experience with the investigator you mentioned in that vaccine trial, is we simply don't know enough about the hospitals and study sites we work with to understand who has cultural competency and outreach when it comes to diverse patient bases and who doesn't. So who do we want to work with, who do we need to educate, and who do we need to think about as we look for different patient populations? And then how do we collect the data to support what we're trying to achieve with the trial? And then the last, but perhaps the most important part, I think, is the patient part of this journey, which is we need to be much better listeners. I think historically we've recognized that we needed to educate people about clinical trials, what they are. You led off the discussion with that observation, Rick.
Yeah.
But to me, that dialogue has changed. I think patients are there to educate us. Why is it that people can't get to a trial? What are the barriers? Is it they can't afford the time or the money to get across town to get into the trial? Are the procedures too demanding? Whatever that is, we need to listen to patients and understand what are they seeking out of this trial and what can we do to ease the burden in trials. And that's becoming more and more possible with things like telemedicine and being able to do things with wearables and all sorts of other stuff. But the short version for me when it comes to patients is we have a lot that we can learn from the rare disease community and listen to the patients with the illness and adapt our plans accordingly. So that's kind of how we structured our journey, Rick.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. And the point I want to emphasize, I know Quita talked about it, you emphasized, we got to at some point have a conversation and put a plan in place to deal with how do we create and inspire more Black Americans going into medicine.
Yeah.
The research that I've been reading as we think about how it even message around not just COVID, but addressing health in general, that we got to have more Black doctors. And those are the influencers as we think about vaccine hesitancy, that folks got to hear from their doctors. They got to hear from public health officials. And so I hope maybe we can work with both of you and other organizations on creating a pipeline and inspiring more African Americans to go into medicine. Quita, if we talk about best practices, Genentech got in this thing early, in the early days of the pandemic, and thinking about diversity in clinical trials. Tell us more about how you did that. What can we learn from your experience as we think about promoting greater diversity in clinical trials during and beyond the pandemic?
So let me just say, Nick, everything he just said, 100% I agree with. I think the number one thing he said was intention. We have to be intentional. And actually, we've been working on advancing inclusive research since 2017, where we were actively thinking about how do we increase diverse representation in clinical trials so that we can focus on patients that have the epidemiology of a particular disease. One of the things that we did from the early days is we formed an external council, which is comprised of leading experts in academia and clinical research and patient advocacy, people who were leading the efforts around this, because if we knew all the right answers, we would have been doing better. And so through this engagement with them, plus engagement with over 100 patient advocate organizations and working with other stakeholders like the FDA, Office of Minority Health, we have been able to start to make some significant improvements in our own organization around inclusion, exclusion criteria, sites that we go to. So when the pandemic hit, we were ready, and we launched a study that we call IMPACTA, which is evaluating minority patients with Actemra, which was a phase 3 randomized double-blind clinical controlled study. And what we did was we primarily enrolled Black, Hispanic, Native American patients. And 85% of the study populations were people of color. Really one of the first times that we've had a study with such a high percentage of people that actually were dying from the disease. And what we did that was different was we sought out hospitals and centers that had large minority underrepresented populations. So we went to Jamaica, Queens in New York. We went to Oakland. We even went to the Navajo Nation. We went to Kenya for the first time, Brazil and Mexico, so that we could really understand the patients of color that had the disease. And I'm happy to report that that was a positive study. But there are some things that are important to understand. A lot of times in our industry, we think we have to go to the same academic sites over and over and over again. And the reality is, it's academic sites and community sites. It is the site where the patient is driving past that facility in their neighborhood. That's the site that they trust, and that's the places that we have to go.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Thank you. I mean, we got to go and meet patients and people where they are. So, but listen, let me say thank you to both of you for a wonderful discussion. Look forward to continuing this dialogue. By the way, as you know, we're going to continue this conversation in mid-February, doing a very dynamic live virtual event, which will be part of our Equality of Opportunity in Action series, where we're convening the business community and other stakeholders to address very, very critical issues as we look to address equality of opportunity in America. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you in mid-February. Thanks so much for watching and being a part of this very important conversation.